Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's west. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. Each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Kevin Brophy, who'll be reading poems and talking with me on the theme of out of place. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Kevin is recording from Brunswick in Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the Yarra River Valley, covering much of the present location of Melbourne, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Kevin Brophy's latest book is the collection of short fiction, The Lion in Love, Finlay Lloyd 2023. His recent poetry collection, Look at the Lake, Hunter and Wattmann 2018, was awarded the Wesley Michel Wright Prize for Poetry. This book recorded a 2-year period of living in a remote desert Aboriginal community in Western Australia. Kevin is a past winner of the Calibre Prize for an outstanding essay. His poetry has appeared in many Best Australian Poems volumes and major national anthologies, including the recent Anthology of Australian Prose Poems, Melbourne University Press 2020, and The Language in My Tongue, an anthology of Australian and New Zealand poetry, FarFlung Editions 2022. In 2015, Kevin was writer-in-residence at the Australia Council's BR Whiting Studio in Rome, and in 2019-20 at the Keesing Studio in Paris. From 1980 to 1994, he was a co-founding editor with Myron Lysenko of Going Down Swinging. From 2007 until 2020, he was a managing editor at Five Islands Press. He has been patron of Melbourne Poets Union since 2004 and is the director of the Five Islands Prize for a first book of poetry. He is an emeritus professor of creative writing at the University of Melbourne. In 2021, he received an Order of Australia Award, AM, for his services to education and creative writing. Kevin has lived in the Melbourne inner city suburb of Brunswick, not far from where he was born, for the past 4 decades. These streets, his home and family, and his backyard have been the source of many poems. Hi, Kevin, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hello, David, and thank you.
You've chosen as your theme, out of place. I wanted to start by asking, what is the significance of place for you?
Well, I guess that whole phrase has two meanings. And one meaning of it is that I write out of the place I'm in. And I guess it's a poetry that arises out of immersion. And it's a poetry that arises out of a kind of, I suppose, the detachment of an observer. And I think I live, strangely enough, in both places at once, as it were, in both attitudes. I'm very immersed in the place where I was born, where I grew up, around Brunswick and Coburg. I've been immersed in these streets for a long time. But even though I am very much at home here, I'm never quite at home. And I guess that's the source of the poetry. The poetry comes out of some unease, as well as it's great familiarity.
But you're not really just referring to physical or geographical inhabited place, are you? Are you talking about it in a broader sense, like a psychological place, emotional place?
Yeah. And I'm also talking about all those places that I have lived in and visited through the course of my life. The out of place, I suppose, is one of those phrases that deals with and points towards a psychological unease. And choosing to be a poet puts me out of place. I mean, I feel very strange telling people I write poetry. And often that's the end of the conversation. It doesn't go any further than that, because it is, well, Australia really isn't the most ideal place to be a poet.
I harbour this naive notion that everyone's a poet, really, but
Yes, yes. Well, I've just come back from 5 weeks in Japan, and it's a very strange place because you go for a bushwalk and you find little notices at turning points in the bushwalk, quoting poets from 1,000 years ago who passed this point, saying things about that place. And you go to museums and galleries, and inevitably, it's the poets who point to interpretations, meanings, and significance of works. And I'm just not used to poets having that kind of reverence or, seriousness.
yeah, well, white Australia isn't very old, is it? We need 1,000 years before we can.
Yeah, yes, yeah, and Aboriginal Australia keeps us in touch with the poetry of the land.
Yeah. You talk about an unease. Would you go so far as to say that it suggests a sense of exile, and is that too much, or is it just more a sense of alienation, or just unease?
Well, there are very personal aspects to the unease to do with my own personal biography. And I guess I don't need to be going into them, except that I never felt that I was quite like very many of the others in years growing up. But also, as I've grown in Australia, it's inevitable that we become conscious of the fact that we have displaced such an ancient culture.
Yes.
And that, even the fact that I burn to a crisp in summer reminds me over and over again of my Irish and Scottish background, that genetically I'd be more suited to living in foggy Scotland
Yeah.
than I am in Australia. That so I am out of place. But the strange thing about that is also that I feel very committed to and at home in and part of the history of Australia. And I don't think that Aboriginal Australia wants us all, as it were, to go home. But there's a tremendous anger, disappointment, and depression at work. But there's also a willingness to accept history among Aboriginal Australians.
Oh, look, I find extraordinary grace in some areas of the Aboriginal attitude towards us. I think I would be angrier than some of them.
Yes, yes.
But you can hold multiple sort of senses of place within you at the same time. They don't have to contradict one another, do they?
No, they don't, and that's that. Well, that's the maybe not the lesson, but that's the place that poetry tries to get at, and to the fact that more than one truth can exist at the same time, and multiple positions can exist at the same time.
Do you think that this idea of being out of place also emerges from the fact that place is inherently transient and that you're perpetually entering it and leaving it?
Well, yeah, that's a good point, David. Having lived in this part of Melbourne for a long time, what I've come to realise is that I'm living in a very fluid environment. The streets and places that I knew in my childhood barely exist any longer. The basic grid is still there, but it's all being pulled down, burnt down, graffitied over, repurposed. New populations have come and gone. The whole place is continually churning through change, even though, weirdly enough, it still feels like the place I grew up in.
You've anticipated my next question, actually, because I was going to ask about that, because place is not static. And as we get older, we can feel a nostalgia for the place as we once knew it, even though we're still here and it's still here.
Yeah. At the last state election, the Labor Party became worried that Brunswick was going to go green, which I think is something that can't really stop happening. And they announced just before the election that they were going to create a sky rail through the railway line here in Brunswick. Or the railway crossings were going to be eliminated, the rail was going to be raised up, etc. And almost immediately after they announced that project, I thought, this is what's going to happen. They're going to build this sky rail, and then a week later, I'm going to think to myself, what was there? I can't remember what was there exactly. So I started a project with a friend who's a photographer. And for the last 12 months, we've been walking up and down the railway line, photographing the railway line. And I've been writing anecdotes and descriptions of what it's like there now, because the place has a ad hoc nature to it. It has a texture. It has a population around it. And it itself is changing. And I just wanted to make sure that there was a record of how the place is now before it's radically re-engineered. And the great attraction of re-engineering it is, as the state government told us, is that we'll get 6 MCGs worth of free space for the community once that happens. And that's all very well, and that's fantastic. But I didn't want to lose well, there are all sorts of urban guerrilla projects happening along the railway line. There's a project to try to get the possums to move between Fawkner Cemetery and Royal Park by planting trees along that line all the way to Fawkner Cemetery. And that's just one of the interesting and bizarre and hopeful projects that are happening along that railway line. And I just wanted to get some of that down on paper and get some of it photographed before the place is landscaped. So yeah, the fluidity of the place is one thing, and remembering how it was is another thing. And the developers always say you can't keep progress back, you can't stop progress. Well, I agree that you can't stop change, but I don't know if change equals progress.
Well, something's always lost, isn't it?
Yeah, something always is lost. Yeah, and something will be gained.
Yeah,
and something will be subverted, and that's all terrific in the long run.
How much do you think this feeling of being out of place goes to questions of identity and belonging?
I'm very fiercely identified with this area, and fiercely identified as a Brunswick resident, fiercely identified with myself as a poet. But at the same time, it all seems a bit ridiculous. So yeah, commitment is one thing, and a fierce kind of identification is one thing, and it's probably necessary. But the more you read, the more you mix with people, the more ridiculous a single dimension for your identity becomes. And of course, that in some ways I don't have many choices. I am what I've been. I am what I've been brought up in. And when I spent 2 years living in an Aboriginal community in the remote desert of Western Australia, the fact that I was an urban kid who knew how to read a book but couldn't identify one plant from another plant came home to me very strongly. And I really have very few choices about who I am. I am what my experience has made me, but that doesn't make me unable to absorb, appreciate, and come to some inkling of understanding other ways of being and other places that I can experience.
Yeah, you've made me think about place. I haven't thought about place. In preparation for this, I've been thinking about place, and I started wondering, you could say this about just about anything, but is place, in a way, a construct? Something we imagine into being, reflecting the subjective way that we relate to and understand the world and our place in it? Or is it more of an imperative for us to search for and find our place in the world?
Is it more of a what?
An imperative. Because we all want to be at home in the world, don't we? But
of course it is a construct. All perception is construct. But it's all and it's also real. I've got no answers to those kind of questions. But I can make reflections, I suppose. And when you think about Aboriginal identification with and custodianship of this land, one of the things you come to realise is that it's not, it never was. It never was the land. It was also the land plus something that we might call spirit, something that we might call dreamtime, something that we might call, infinity, or we might call it culture. There's always that other less tangible place around the physical environment that you live in. And it's the intangible significances, the intangible symbolisms. For some people, it's religion that melds with place and gives it, I don't know, something substantial and something human. And I guess that, it's not just Brunswick and Coburg that I'm attached to here. It's got a lot to do with it's got a lot to do with values, and it's got a lot to do with kind of the attachment of spirit to place and place to spirit. And I don't want to sound like I'm over borrowing Aboriginal culture, or that I'm becoming a religious fanatic about the significance of the world, but there's always another place. And I think poetry points to the melding of the human with the physical very much, because there is never just the physical. There is always some kind of, for us anyway, there's always, we need to build culture in place.
I mean, I've always understood the Aboriginal reference to country as not just being the land. It's got to be something more than that. It's the connection.
Yeah.
And whether that's spiritual or cultural or otherwise, it's the connection that makes it so significant, I think. It strikes me that reading your poems, that they're often writing about place and exploring place, and that in that sense, they are more in place than out of place. What do you say about that?
Well, out of place doesn't mean necessarily out of place, does it? Out of place means coming out of a place. And I think of my poetry as coming out of the places that I'm in, not out of place, not necessarily out of place in the place I'm in. So, yeah, my poetry is an attempt to place myself in the environment I find myself in, and that has to do with the people as much as it has to do with physical things. It has more to do with people, I guess, than with physical place.
Yeah. All right. Shall we get onto some poems?
Yeah. And speaking of people, I'd like to begin by reading a poem called The Tobacco Poem. And the Tobacco Poem was written in the last months of the 2-year stint I spent in the Aboriginal community of Mullen in the WA Great Sandy Desert. And this community lives beside a lake, and they are the custodians of that lake. And there's only about 150 people in the community. And I was working, well, I wasn't really working, I was volunteering at the Catholic school there, and my partner Andrea was teaching in the school. And anyway, we had a car, and that's quite an asset. And of course, we spent a bit of time driving people around the desert and driving people here, there, and everywhere. So anyway, the Tobacco Poem. Father said mass out on the veranda. Bottles of water near everyone. children moving like smoke among us, and behind the priest, a small hill of the oldest, most twisted rocks God could grow spinifex around. Locals call it Jesus's Hill. A white cross on top crookedly juts into a crayon blue sky. The hill has more ancient names, but people say it's Jesus' Hill, as if Jesus spent a night there. And he might have. And if he didn't, he would have wanted to if he could. It's a good low hill, next to a water tower locals climb when they're out of prayers and hope, so others who live here will come to the base of it and call up to them, "Don't jump. We love you. It will destroy us if you jump. Come down." And somehow, shaky though that person is, the people manage to talk her down off that tower, and they sit on Jesus' Hill for a while, as if Jesus had performed another miracle. The priest poured from his travelling chalice and took out a neat pack of hosts, while women sang in their language songs about forgiveness, mercy, creation. I understood the feelings, but not the words. At the end, we all shook hands in a sign of peace before cups of tea and plain biscuits came around. While we drank our tea, Bessie, Eileen, Karen, and Lulu asked me if they could get a lift to Belgo for shopping. 4 of the most important women in town. I said, "Yes, we'll take you. Go home, get your purses, wallets and bags, and we'll pick you up in 20 minutes. We drove across creeks and through families of wild horses to Belgo, to the lavish new shop built last year with a government grant. We stopped outside. The 4 women sat in the car. "We have no money," they said. "We want tobacco. Will you buy us tobacco?" I bought them orange juice and soothing ices, but they wanted tobacco. We sat at a table outside the shop. I said I wouldn't buy tobacco, even if it was my own children asking. "Tobacco will kill you," I said. "Yes," Bessie said, "it will kill me, but I'm not going to die tomorrow, so you needn't worry about how you feel." Bessie said she'd never go home until I bought her tobacco. The other women watched. Lulu did buy tobacco, but, she said, it was someone else's money, and the tobacco was for someone else, not for sharing. She kept it in her pocket. I don't know how it happened, but at last we were all back in the car, squashed up against each other, breathing each other's wishes, fears, prayers. "All right," Bessie said, "you go this way," without pointing. Reading her mind, I went the wrong way, then the right way. We stopped outside a house and got directed to another house. Now it was ash they wanted, the tasty ash from the peeling bark of the Wirramunguru tree, to make chewing tobacco last and give it desert flavour. Another house, a black pig being hosed, and a naked man, beard to his navel, sitting on a blanket outside his home. Some scraps of tobacco were passed into the car, pressed onto a palm. No one at Belgo had the ash. More houses for more tobacco scraps, until we left town talking about where ash can be found at this time of year. Halfway back, one woman said, "All right, now you must write us the tobacco poem." We slid back into town on this promise, unsure what had happened, hoping for the best, and under no illusions about the power of tobacco and poetry in this desert. Next day, I agreed to drive out for Wirramunguru Bark by the lake, and after 2 slow trips through faint tracks among salt wattle trees, Shirley Umari found the bark. We harvested 2 bags of it to burn down to ash, to mix in with the tobacco, for the good chewing. It was nearly time for next week's Mass. With last week's prayers blessedly settled, we thought, until Shirley and Waylon came banging on our door in the early bright morning to tell us Shirley's purse had dropped to the ground as she gathered that bark, her purse with everything in it that proved who she was at the shop and the clinic. Back out through the slow waking brolga and nervous wild horses to the place where we'd been, and there on the ground, sparkling, Shirley's purse, as if Jesus himself had placed it there at our feet. Every day after that, Lulu would say, "Remember the tobacco poem. Have you written it? Have you written it yet?" "Yes, yes, the tobacco poem," I'd say. "I'll write it." Though the words won't sparkle, like Shirley's purse, on the sand in the morning light under salt bottle shade, with the startled horses looking back over their shoulders at us, bent to the ground, as if in prayer over something.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Glad you read that one. Just to give me an idea of distances, how far away was the town that you went to, Balgo?
Balgo was about maybe a half an hour drive through on a very rough road, a road that was quite often closed because of floods across the road.
Yeah. So it wasn't like you were in the car for hours and hours and hours, but there's a little bit of a community of souls in the car.
Yes, yes.
So this book is from, and this poem is from Look at the Lake, which is all about that 2-year period. A wonderful, wonderful book where you are an outsider, an interloper in a place not your own, that you're observing through poetry. Tell us about, I guess, the book and this poem's relationship to that place.
Yes, I was an outsider, and it was brought home to me every day that I was, a white man in Black people's country, and it fascinated me to be that, because all my life I'd lived as a white man in a city full of white people, with white man's rules and laws, and feeling very comfortable and at home and skilled and knowledgeable about ways of life here in Melbourne. And suddenly I was the outsider, and not just the outsider, but the ignorant, naive, at a loss outsider. And, a few things that happened. One piece of advice that Andrea and I got at the start was never make a suggestion. Always follow what has been suggested. Don't come in with your own ideas. So, okay, that's okay. So, yeah, Andrea got involved in I know it sounds ridiculous, but she got involved in the Tidy Towns project, and Mullen became some kind of finalist in the Tidy Towns project, and there was funding attached to it, I think. And anyway, we got this metal sign that we were meant to put up at the entrance to the town, and at the entrance to the town there was a car hood jammed into the earth, and on the car hood was written, "No killers here." And I thought, what's going on? What does that mean? What that had to do with was the wild bulls and the wild steers that roam, that are remnants of the old ranching that was once done in this desert, and all that's left of that are some broken down fences and these monstrously large wild bulls, which the people call killers, and they go out and kill these killers and bring them back and share the meat around every now and again. So anyway, there was a warning to people not to come here expecting to be fed with killers. And we wanted to put the Tidy Town sign there. And the only person we could find who could do it is the ranger. And the ranger had a truck, and the ranger had authority, and the ranger knew what was what in town. So we went to the ranger and we said, can we put this sign at the front of, we're finalists in the Toady Town competition and we're going to get this funding, and can we put this sign up at the entrance of the town? And he said, yes, put the sign in the back of my truck. So we put the sign in the back of his truck. A week went by, 2 weeks went by, a month went by. The sign was still lying there in the back of his truck. Nothing happened. And finally I said to him, are you going to put that sign up that you said you would? And he said, I can't put the sign up until there's a meeting. And I said, in my white man's way, I said, when is the meeting happening? He said, that's difficult. He said, that's soon. That's the meeting soon. Ask me next week. So I went again next week. And I said, did you have the meeting? He said, yes, we had the meeting. And I said, so you're going to put the sign up? He said, it's not easy. It's not easy. And I said, He said, okay. And then I realised it was never going to go up, that I was never going to get no for an answer. I was always going to get yes or wait or maybe. No would never, no is just not a word that's ever used. And I just realised I was the white man who didn't understand anything about the local customs, local ways of doing things. And I'd made the huge mistake of initiating something, and that they weren't going to ever put that sign up. So that was one thing. Also, that I found a couple of canoes at the school that hadn't been used for years and years. And obviously they've been taken out on the lake. So I was talking to one of the local people. I said, I found some canoes at the school. We might go out on the lake. And he said, this was very shortly after I arrived. And he said, oh yes, you can do that. But what you have to know is if you go out to the middle of the lake in a boat, you will never come back. I said, okay. And so I never did go out on the boat. But when I thought about what he said, and I realised he was, of course he was pulling my leg, but he was also playing on my respect for his knowledge and my ignorance. And he knew that he could say the most ridiculous things, and me being the reverential white person who thought he had black knowledge would say, is that true? Oh, okay, I won't. So I was very much the outsider. But I was also, it took me months to distinguish one person from another in the community. I didn't know their personalities, and for some reason all their faces just all looked very similar to me. But I also realised that they were having the same trouble with me because, my name's Kevin, my partner's name is Andrea, and they started calling me Andrew because they couldn't even tell the difference between me and Andrea because we're just both white faces. So they were having exactly the same kind of trouble separating us as we were having separating them. So there was that kind of weird thing happening before we became people to each other.
What I like about this poem is, and you wrote the readers in a way. I get the sense in the poem that though you're terribly out of place, place is calling to you and saying, "Come in, you're welcome here." There is just in the chat with the women, there is a sense of inclusivity, an invitation to the poet to enter the place. When the poet is asked to write the tobacco poem, you're really being invited to come in. There is a recognition there of your place as poet, as chronicler, and you're asked in a sense to fix the place, to bring it to life so that others outside can see it, which is what this book does. Do you think that the act of writing poetry about place like this connects you to place and moves you from being out of place towards being part of place?
Very much, very much. And it changed my life, really. I can't ever claim any sense of belonging in the way that the local people have a sense of belonging there, but I think I got as close as I was capable of getting by writing poems from an outsider's point of view.
Mm.
And there is I'm sure I've made a lot of mistakes in that book in terms of my understanding of the place, but maybe too I've opened it up. I've opened the place up to a wider audience.
Well, I mean, it's a celebration of place, really, isn't it?
Yes. I think that what I realised when the opportunity opened up to go to Mullen was that I had always felt incomplete as an Australian because I didn't know Aboriginal Australia, and I didn't know the desert. I didn't know the north. All I knew was urban Australia, and I'd always had the feeling that that everything else was kind of theoretical to me, that I hadn't really encountered Australia fully, and there was this sense of incompleteness.
So, you're able to scratch that itch.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that after you wrote this poem, you shared it with the women who asked you to write it. What was their reaction?
They loved me reading it out to them. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, something that is central to this poem for me is community. What do you think the significance of community is to place?
I don't quite know how to answer that, except that that the people of Mullen were moved to Belgo by the government at one stage in the 1960s, I think, and Belgo is a town created by the government, and 4 or 5 different Aboriginal language groups have been moved there, and there's a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing, a lot of disagreement, a lot of violence in that town, partly because no one owns or belongs there. And eventually, in the 1970s, the people of Mullen asked to go back to their lake. But the interesting thing is that the lake had dried up while they were away, and when they came back, the lake filled again. And they saw this and explained this as evidence that the lake knew they were back, and the lake was now willing to be fruitful and full of water again, and that the lake had suffered from their absence when it dried. So this melding of people and place is very strong there, and strong in a way that I'd never encountered before. And it has a kind of magicalness to it. A couple of stories, maybe. The storms that came in, you could see the storms coming from 100 kilometres away, and you could see the sky coming down, and every now and again these storms would be so magnificent that we couldn't help but walk out into them and experience them and just wonder at them. And we did that one night, and then the next day, the whole town was saying to us, "Oh, you went out last night. You went out into the desert last night," because they knew where we were all the time. So there's this hyper awareness of what's going on around them, which is partly to do with trauma, but also partly to do with their sensitivity to place. And there were places that were dangerous to go to, places that they warned us not to go to, and places they would take us to that were sacred and important, and had all sorts of artifacts, God knows how old, lying around. So yeah, there was a kind of absence of boundary between people and place.
Almost a symbiosis, do you think?
Yeah, very much. And which is its own wondrous thing, but also a source of much pain for the people who live there, because there was nowhere for them to go except Darwin or Perth or Broome, and a lot of the men there knew that chances were they'd end up in youth detention or prison. That was just part of what was going to happen to them in life. And the girls would be, out looking for a life in Darwin. So there weren't very many opportunities for growth, development, work, income in Mullen. And yet they were fundamentally connected to the place, so connected with it that they would sicken if they're away from it, which is its own huge dilemma.
Just to give me an idea, how big is the lake?
It's in, it's probably about, 10, 15 kilometres wide. It's a salt lake, and it does shrink and then expand and shrink and expand. And the community lived on the edge of the flood zone of the lake. And maybe once every couple of decades, the lake would completely flood and be hugely wide.
All right. Would you like to read another poem?
Yeah, and it's called A Place. Children shiver over canteen porridge in the morning. I'm still dizzy from going out without a hat yesterday. The ranger talks of caring for his grandmother's land. I forget to go out to the airstrip on time. Thumps of a football being kicked at school. Two young men in opposing jumpers walk together. A boy says to a teacher, "This place is sacred and that rock is too." A girl puts too much tinsel on an Eagles poster. The tinsel will stick to the veranda for months. A boy writes in large red letters, "Mullen dingoes." I learn mullen is the name of a miniature tree. Crows knock down our bins and kick our garbage down the road with perfect contempt for it. Later, I read an essay on the hatred of poetry and find in it, after all, a place for the world.
Oh, those crows are ubiquitous, aren't they?
Yeah, they're pretty smart.
There seem to be several places in this poem. The ranger caring for his grandmother's land, the boy's sacred place, the poet's perspective of that place, and a place for the world. What is this poem saying about place exactly?
It's the poem of an outsider, but it's, as you say, it's a poem of someone who's drawn to the idea of place and drawn to the experience of place. And it's a poem about the contradictoriness. When the boy says to the teacher, "This place is sacred and that rock is too," he says it so casually. He says it almost as if like a formula. And like saying, this is Union Street and that's Sydney Road. And it's curious to me that it can be so matter of fact and almost in a sense trivial, but in other senses, it's everything that makes life significant for that boy, because that boy lives in abject poverty and he lives without a voice in the larger place of Australia. He's a boy who probably will never learn to read and write competently. And what does he have? He has his community, and he has this country and its sacredness. And it's the last and only big thing in his life, that the place is sacred and the rock is too. And yet he says it in such a throwaway way that I find myself, in and out of place listening to him. And the girl who puts the tinsel on the Eagles poster, football, the community doesn't simmer with anger and it doesn't simmer with resentment. It simmers with, somehow, I don't know how, it simmers with hope. And it simmers with all the kind of, exactly the same kind of enthusiasms that we have in our communities, enthusiasms for football and, you know, football teams and footballers. And I kind of, I suppose I was grabbing at things that I thought I understood, but also interested in the strangeness of clearly not fully understanding. There are contradictions all the way through the poem.
Yeah, and they're pointing to or at different signifiers of place, whether they be place names like Mullandingos or local landmarks like sacred rocks and airstrips, or even local rituals like canteen porridge. How much of place is contained in these signifiers and the accumulation of lots of small details? I mean, detail is very important, isn't it?
I guess this is one of those cumulative poems, and yet I suppose that my method and my hope and my commitment in poetry is to the possibility that details will give you eventually a world. And I like to think of poetry as the place where the details that history forgets get archived. And this is one of those poems.
I mean, for the reader, it's a doorway into the world, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm very intrigued by the last two lines of the poem. Later, I read an essay on the hatred of poetry and find in it, after all, a place for the world. Can you elaborate on that? How on earth do you find a place for the world in an essay on the hatred of poetry?
Well, those lines are an echo of a couple of lines in a poem by Marianne Moore, where she writes about she writes about reading modern poetry and hating it, hating reading poetry, and yet after all she finds something there that was worth it. And the hatred of poetry was, you know, I think I must have been reading an essay on that poem or on Marianne Moore, and her hatred of in that poem anyway, her hatred of incompetent poetry, of the kind of poetry that was being written too often. And I suppose even in failures, we find the world, you know, because it's become more and more evident to us lately that we are, as creatures, a failure on this planet, and yet we're pretty wonderful creatures. And how that works, I don't know, but I think these, you know, what I didn't want to do was go into the desert and either idealise place or idealise Aboriginal people. And what I discovered was that that the Aboriginal people were as full of the sort of contradictions that we're full of. You know, these people were Catholics, and they'd chosen to be a Catholic community, and they'd chosen to have a Catholic school, and you know, one of the contradictions of that is that when it came time for communion, and communion is the most sacred thing of all Catholic rituals, is the reception of the host on the tongue of the people who believe that it's the flesh and blood of Christ. Okay, so the priest gets out the hosts, and Lulu, the head woman, puts her hand out, and the priest has to give her half a dozen hosts. She closes her hand over the hosts and puts them in her pocket. And then the priest says, Lulu, you know you've got to give those out. You can't just hang on to them. And, you know, this is the kind of contradiction that I loved witnessing in that community. And this poem is about those contradictions.
There's a place in the world for poetry.
And for failed poetry,
Yeah. All right. Wonderful. Another poem?
Maybe I should introduce this poem by saying that often the only way to get into Mullen was to fly in. The roads were very treacherous and often closed. Ways of flying out of here. You could join the passing angels at night. You could transform into a midday eagle. You could be taken by the flying doctor to join others considering mortality from the sky. Or you could fly shakily to a holiday destination in a single propeller plane, too light to puncture clouds. You could jump on the blue and silver mail plane to lie down with the parcels, your head on the flying, yearning letters of the lonely. You could be taken by several planes on a hopping journey to a place in a city where you find yourself at night dreaming of a red dirt gravel airstrip in the scrub, lined by plastic cones and termite mounds, just outside a happenstance of homes that you remember felt like home.
And which of those ways did you take, Kevin?
Just about all of them.
I mean, the poem's all about ways of flying out of a place, but the sense I get is that you're taking the place with you, that you have internalized it and you can't get away from it that easily.
Yeah.
I mean, we take ourselves with us wherever we go, and we take all our emotional baggage with us too. Is that part of what this poem is trying to say?
Yeah, and also that the place has had a profound effect on me. And, it's, I just loved being there. And after living there for 2 years, when I saw films that showed the desert and the desert colours, I would cry, which shocked me. But that's how deeply, not quite, I wouldn't say at home I was, but that's how deeply connected I felt to the place.
Did coming back to Brunswick seem strange?
Well, I needed to come back to Brunswick. The other thing that was happening was, after 2 years in that environment, my health was suffering. Yeah. Both of our healths were suffering. You just can't get a healthy diet in that place. And you can't exercise. The heat is too oppressive. I couldn't live without air conditioning. I was moving from one air-conditioned building to another air-conditioned building and wilting in between them. So staying healthy in that environment wasn't easy. And most of the people were chronically ill anyway, for all sorts of reasons. And one reason is that not much good food gets there, and the temperatures just well into the 40s for a good part of the year.
The place gets under your skin, doesn't it? I mean,
well, yeah, it does. Yeah, and I needed to get back to Brunswick, and I needed to be somewhere where I, as it were, knew the ropes. But also, as I was saying before, it also somehow completed me as an Australian.
The last line of this poem, to me, captures three aspects of place: the remembering of a place, that you remember felt like home, the feeling of a place, and the notion of place as home. As occurs in that line, those three aspects are all intertwined. Do you want to say something about your thinking of those three aspects and how they relate to one another?
Is one of the things that poetry points to, which is an attempt to be conscious, and being at home in a place. Often it's a bit like I suppose being happy and being content. It's not something you think about or even realise is happening or realise is there. It's an and people will say, people might say all of a sudden to you, oh, you're very at home here, and you suddenly think, oh, yeah, I am, but that's not what was in my mind, or that was not anything I was conscious of. But of course, that's right. I'm very at home on a bicycle, and but I'm not consciously at home on a bicycle. It's just that me and the bicycle are at one with each other when it's happening, and I don't even have to think about. I don't think about it. So maybe a consciousness of home can only arise out of separation from home, and that's one of the things that this, home, of course, as you were saying about place, home can be as much a construct as a reality, and the feeling comes home to you most powerfully when you're separated from the place.
So it's not about being present in the moment so much.
Well, yeah, if present in the moment means a consciousness of presentness in the moment, yeah. We're both very much at home in the English language, and we're talking to each other in the English language, but we're not thinking about the English language as we talk, unless it's brought to our attention, and we say, "Oh yeah, that's right. That's a pretty good sentence I just used." It was the sentence of a native speaker, but most of the time we're just not. We're just at home in it without thinking or knowing we're at home in it. Mullen was never quite like that. Mullen was always banging at my consciousness, and Mullen was always sort of prickling me. And yet, after 2 years there, to go back there would feel like going back home.
Yeah, I mean, if it's always banging at your consciousness, did you feel more alive in a way?
Very much, yes. And yes, very much. And I think that I could see that happening to the other white people in the community. They were vivified by the place. Some people were frustrated. Some people were going mad. Some people were just tired. And I could understand all of that as well. But other people you could see were just that they become addicted to the effect of that that effect of strangeness.
Is one of the functions of poetry for you to pin or fix a place in a moment in time, much like a photograph does? So that, for example, you have in this poem fixed in place a red dirt gravel airstrip in the scrub lined by plastic cones and termite mounds just outside a happenstance of homes.
I know that there's something about those lines that make it seem like a picture. But there's something else about those lines too, which has to do with the music and rhythm of the lines. Yes, I do want to make a picture, but the other thing is that there's the rhythm and music of the language also that draws me into the making of the lines.
Okay. Shall we go back into the lake?
The lake is blue. Blue lies like a lake on the lake. Grass stands up wiry all the way to the blue lake. Everyone mentions the lake once or twice a day. It's a blue shadow on the mind. No one's thirst can be quenched there. The old salty tongue of the earth is in it. Sun peers down into it. The lake's face shudders under breezes. That whisper it makes along its edges leaves a slim rime of salt circling its blue dream. Red earth reddens as the day goes away. The lake lies low, like a child lying down beside a mother who talks to her of the lake and the last time they were there.
You've mentioned the relationship of the community, the people to the lake, and that amazing transformation of it back into being a lake rather than an empty lake when they returned. And, you've entitled the whole book, Look at the Lake. So the lake's clearly a very significant place. And, in the poem, everyone mentions the lake once or twice a day. It's sort of very front of mind. So is the lake more than just a lake? Is it a metaphor? And if so, to what is it alluding?
Well, it's talking about that intermingling of people and place. One of the experiences that we had at the lake was when one of the elders, one of the magic men visited, and one of his jobs was to welcome newcomers, and we were newcomers. And the way of welcoming newcomers was to take us to the lake and kneel us down in the shallows of the lake and then cover our bodies with mud. And what the purpose, as it was explained to us, the purpose of this was to make us smell like the lake, so that there was a snake in the lake, so that the great snake, and the lake was in the shape of a snake, in the people's minds, and the great snake that was in the lake would know that we were part of the lake and part of the community, because we smelled like the lake after having the mud pressed all around our bodies. So yeah, it's about that melding of people with place, and it's never just metaphorical. It's never just symbolic, and it's never just religious. It's a kind of actual melding of people with place, and that's what startled and interested and amazed me.
I know that there are many ways to be in a place, particularly if it is a place that we are in temporarily, we're visiting, and it's easy to have a superficial relationship to place, to see the obvious but not to see what lies beneath it. And this poem suggests that there is much more to the lake than meets the eye, that it's a blue shadow on the mind, and that it's a blue dream. Is your poetry an attempt to dig into place, to try and see more than the obviously visible?
Well, all it would be a document if it didn't believe that there was more to place than the physical attributes of place. So the answer has to be yes, and the answer has to be that without that yes, there's no poetry. Maybe I've got a quasi religious kind of view of poetry, but without wanting to or needing to spell out exactly what the significance of place is or the significances of place are, I do believe that we are that we are part of. Okay, it's hard to, that poetry points to the human significance of things, I suppose. These things don't exist without human significance, at least for us. You know, it's that old question, isn't it? That old question of does a tree that falls in a forest make a sound if no one's there to hear it?
Yeah.
And you know, my answer to that question is yes. It wouldn't make a sound. There's no sound unless we hear it. But that's, you know, it's not the answer is never as simple as that. But you can kind of, that sound is only a human thing when humans hear it. I don't know. I don't quite know how to put that into words. And poetry.
I have that argument with people about whether or not beauty can exist without anyone to appreciate it.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's a poet's answer, isn't it? That there's always something beneath. That we're always, I mean, as poets, I think poetry is kind of like archaeological. We're always looking for what's beneath.
Yes. And I think poetry is always looking for what can't be said in words. And that's the great challenge and attraction of poetry, that what you're trying to talk about can't be talked about. And so it's got to be talked around.
And it's got to be ambiguous.
Yes.
What do you mean in this poem when you write, no one's thirst can be quenched there?
Well,
Apart from the fact that it's a salt lake, so you can't drink it.
Mm. The lake will always throw up mysteries, and the lake mesmerizes, and the lake, the lake never stops giving. The lake gave us Brolga. That lake attracts the largest numbers of Brolga of any lake in Australia, and to watch the Brolga was such a gift. And the wild budgerigars, we'd go and camp by the lake every now and again, and we'd see flocks of wild budgerigars, which is a very rare thing to see these days. So the lake just keeps giving.
And I guess what you're suggesting is that place is not ultimately knowable. It always contains mystery.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I think that's all the poems from this book. We're going to move on to poems from another book. Do you want to read another poem, please?
In This Part of the World, which is a chapbook published during COVID lockdown. And there's a little poem in there called What the Finch Knows. And a year after our time in the Mullen Desert, we went to the far north of Australia for a couple of months, travelling and camping. And we were chasing the Gordian finch for a little while there. And I became fascinated with the finches and spent a long time just watching them with binoculars, not just the Gordian finch, but all sorts of finches. And after a while, I felt that I was coming to understand what kind of creatures they are. So what the finch knows. The finch knows mainly one thing. Its joy is full of it. Body a quiver with sensible fears of what today might slide shadowy over it. The finch knows to keep each eye on each side of its world as it splashes in a roadside puddle of light and sand and broken water. The finch knows mainly this one thing. Its love is full of it. It fills trees with twisting flight. The finch plays close to others out of fearful love and disappears into leafy worlds when the near wind hisses like a cruel husband frightening his latest wife. The finch is loved for being small, bright, neat, fast. It knows every seed and spring in every wrinkle of its fearful, songful world. The finch knows how to live in joyful fright and fret, knows every shadow in every corner of its world.
My first question, I'm curious to know why you chose to read this poem on a general theme of out of place.
Well, I have to confess, David, that I wasn't really thinking much about the theme.
That's all right.
But the finch, clearly the finch knows its place in the world. And its place in the world is as a tiny, pretty helpless creature. And its place in the world gives it its role. And its role, its knowledge, its skill is fear. And it knows how to live with fear. And of course it has to live with fear, being so small and maybe, I don't know if it's delicious to eat or not, but it's small enough to be hunted because nearly every other hunter is bigger than it. So anyway, it has its place, and it has its role, and it has its both demanding and commanding emotion in my mind at that moment of writing that poem.
Yeah. So you just wanted to read this poem because you wanted to read this poem?
Yeah.
All right. I mean,
what do you make of it as a poem about out of place?
Well, a bit like what you said, the finch intimately knows its place. There's nothing of the uncertainty that humans have about place. But I was conscious of the recurrence of fear throughout the poem. I was wondering whether that was referring to the precariousness of its place with the destruction of or pressure on its habitat, or to its susceptibility to predators, of which there are many.
Yeah, I think that when I say roadside puddle, I think that for me indicates the reduction of its habitat. It's reduced to having to use roadside puddles to get its water. And roadside puddles, of course, are very dangerous places to play in. It'd be much preferable if they had a wide expanse of wilderness and could find their puddles in the wilderness. It's not possible any longer. So that this is a kind of gesture towards that problem in the roadside puddle.
I also wondered whether, the narrator of the poem was almost longing for the same degree of immersion in place.
I suppose I worry about my level of identification with the finch. Do I see myself as a finch of the world?
It's not possible to live in this world without fear now, probably.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know much about finches, so thank you for this poem.
I don't know if you know much more about finches after that, but...
Well, a little bit more. What would you like to read next?
I'd like to read a poem called After You, which which is in the selected poems.
Yep.
We're just holding up. And it goes like this. You wake from dreams after reading a passage in a book about yourself. You book a passage from dreams in a wake after reading about yourself. After reading, you wake a book from dreams about a passage in yourself. After dreams, you wake yourself from a book about reading in a passage. You wake from a reading in book dreams after a passage about yourself. After a book reading, you wake from yourself in a passage about dreams. You wake yourself reading from a passage about after dreams in a book. After reading in a passage about a book, you wake yourself from dreams.
I found this quite hypnotic. How did you come to write this poem?
I think I've read a similar exercise by, I can't remember who it was or what the poem was, and I thought I'd love to be able to find a sentence that could accommodate a whole set of variations. And here it's 2, 4, 6, 8 variations before I ran out of puff. And they're not easy. I set myself the task of finding a sentence that would tolerate being reassembled. It wasn't easy to find one.
Oh no, it wouldn't be.
And when I found this passage, I can't remember how I found it. When I found this sentence, I thought, yes, I've got a sentence here that maybe can tolerate the variations. And then the variations took on a life of their own. They seem to generate meaning. In a way, they're almost random rearrangements of the words. But the strange thing is that language itself is a kind of meaning-making engine. And if you've got the prepositions and verbs and subjects and objects lined up, it does seem to make sense, or the reader reads sense into it. And that sentence seems to accommodate our desire to make sense of words.
It seems to me to signify that sort of mystery that's involved in writing a poem. Where does the poem come from and how does a poem come to be? And it's a mysterious process. And I think, I don't know how much readers find that, but writers of poetry, and in my experience, love that they don't know where the poem's going to go or how it's coming to being. And then there it is. But what you've done here, you've got the same 13 words appearing in a different order in each of the 8 lines of the poem, and 2 of those words appear in the title. And there's no exception to that. Each line perfectly embodies that rearrangement of the same words. The poem has a shifting, almost dreamlike quality, and seems to me to be like a hall of mirrors. Are you trying to give readers a sense of the mysteries and possibilities in language and in poetry?
Yeah, I'm trying, and I'm reminding myself of that too with it. I'm curious about being led by language. And when I talked before about being attracted by the rhythms and music that I hear in the lines, it's not so much that I create the music or the rhythms, it's that the language draws me in with its musics and rhythms. And here, I'm curious about where language can take me, and hopefully can take the reader. And
yeah, I mean, these lines are a little bit like a puzzle, and so you can read the poem, but then for me, I have to go back to each line and try and work out what the meaning is of each line. Like a puzzle. It's a fascinating exercise.
And then by the end, it doesn't really matter how much sense each line makes. It's more to do with more to do with the kind of eddying of language and meaning.
Yeah, and it also, in terms of the theme of place, it references several places where we might find ourselves. We might find ourselves in books or in dreams or in ourselves. And in arguably each of those places, we are sometimes strangers, or they're provisionally, or there is something nebulous in our being in those places, such that in each of them, it could be said that we are out of place.
Yes.
So the poem's on theme. Both in our external physical lives and in our internal lives, we're constantly moving from place to place. I guess this poem for me begs the question, where and when are we not out of place? Even in sleep, we're out of place. We're dreaming, and it's strange, and it's we have limited recollection of it the next day. And
maybe this has to do with, I don't know, with the human condition. We seem to have this, as human beings, we seem to have this strange consciousness which no one can properly explain, with biologists and physicists can't properly explain the presence of consciousness. But consciousness is a kind of disorienting and disorientation. We're never quite, because we are conscious of our consciousness, or capable of being conscious of our consciousness, we can never quite be at home. We are always, maybe you could say we're the questioning creatures. And one of the most dangerous things that can happen to us is that we think we know the answers. That's when our ability to be conscious reduces so much that we're capable of quite brutal and brutish and great cruelty. But as long as we can ask questions, we're never quite at home. And as long as we can ask questions, perhaps we're as human as we can possibly be.
Well, we're not solely instinctive, are we? So there's different forces at work. There's the force of instinct at work, and then there's a force of conscious thought, sometimes countering the instinct. I
imagine that the last human being alive on the planet will die writing a poem.
Hopefully not soon. Did you want to read us another one?
The Sublime. At 86 and 91, they are still together, more or less, and greet me at the door as if I am the punchline to a joke they were just recalling. My mother staggers sideways in the drive, My father reaches for a wall, a rail, an arm, with the urgency telephones demand. They know what it is now and do their best to hide this knowledge from us, agreeing to be forgetful and ever more frail. They can't help grinning at the picture they must make. They must be driven to appointments. My mother toys with the idea of a new knee. My father trembles to the tiny drum machine beneath his ribs. And their eyes go cloudy, ears a solid silent blue, their mouths half open to let out the unspoken, because they know what it is now. The small days come, flowers in the garden, drugs delivered to the door, postcards in the box outside. She has a sturdy stick to hold down against this earth, tapping as if to wake someone down there, a warning they are coming.
It's I'm interested in how affectionate this poem is. You know, it could be maudlin or morose or sad, but it's not. It's actually joyful. I think. And they know what it is now, and they don't want you to know, but you're going to know too, right?
Yeah.
Here's a couple who've been together for so many years. Haven't they made a place for themselves and for each other? And isn't that a place where you are greeted and made welcome? Isn't it partly your place as well?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
So this is the other place that we haven't sort of talked about so much, the hearth of the family, which we all endeavour to make that place, don't we?
Yeah, and that's maybe the reason that I put this poem in, is that it comes back to that, the family as place, and it comes back to. It's also coming back to that the big question, isn't it, of our mortality. We're all heading to that place, and often our parents go before us. That was kind of. I remember my daughter, when she was a little toddler. She said to me one day, "Are you going to die?" And I said, "Yes, I'm going to die." And she said, "I want to be there to watch you die." And in a way, I was watching my parents die. But I was also trying to come to terms with my own ideas, feelings, fears about death, and asking the question, can you die in a way? Can you die naturally? Can it just be the next thing that happens and no more than that?
Yeah, and it's positing other questions too. It's positing, well, you know, what are we here for? You know, what is the meaning? So there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, you know, whether the theme could have been, as much as its place, it could have been transience. You know, we're in this place called life for as long as we can be, and then this place too is gone, and it is as if we were never there in the first place.
Yes, very much.
Anything else you wanted to say about this poem? Why is it sublime?
I guess I'm trying to suggest that there might be something triumphant about achieving death, and that death, you know, if there is anything sublime for us to experience, perhaps it's either death or approaching death.
Is that a spiritual perspective?
Not well. It's a paradoxical perspective. I think that what is that we all want to experience the sublime, whatever the sublime is in life, and you know, beauty. We all want to experience and appreciate and know beauty, at some sublime level. But what I'm trying to do here is suggest that maybe the sublime is not found in beauty. Maybe sublime can be found in deterioration, in frailty, in acceptance of the human death as it comes at us.
Well, the argument is that life would have no meaning if there wasn't death.
Yes.
And so it's an integral part of the process.
Which is difficult to, I mean, it's, in a way, it's easy to say it, but difficult to live it, and
yes.
difficult to accept it. Strangely enough, this is a poem I couldn't show my parents. I couldn't bring myself to show to them.
That's interesting. How much longer did they live?
My father lived to 97. My mother lived to 93. So they lived another 7 years after this.
Yeah.
6 years, 6 or 7 years after this.
Yeah.
And they weren't good years.
No.
They were chaotic years.
Well, I mean, the difficulty is when people lose their dignity in the process, and that's always very hard.
So maybe this is just that moment. Maybe this is that moment before the chaos takes hold. That's often accompanies death, and
when it was still possible to celebrate.
Yeah.
All right. And you have one late edition for us, one more poem.
There is one more poem. And
from your forthcoming book.
Yes, and it's the title poem from the book. And it's called An Inventory of Longing. Is there something we long for in the after vapours of a war everyone's forgotten? And if memory needs an inventory of everything to be sure what this longing's for, why not start with a household spoon, say? Swift, smooth spoon that longs for open lips. Or its shining cousin, the three-toed fork that knows only a well-stabbed world. Its forkish dream always to swoop, pierce, fly through the air into split-open mouths. We count among all there is to remember, the common carpet too, made of all that's smoky, thin, trampled in, dull, and finally thin and touchy as a child laid out in a school infirmary. Doors too, whose tongues long for locks, whose pleasure is a tangle of bells in your head, in thrall to the clawed-in fingers of hinges, yearning slaves of their golden handles. And the knife, medieval tongue of steel, lying in the kitchen drawer shining, knowing only how to divide butter from butter, bread from bread, cake from cake, and wing from leg. Yes, the brighter, longer and sharper each knife gets, the closer it comes to the wars it longs for, where it can ride with the tottering dictators, whose eyes are cases of knives, whose tongues are dark forks in their throats, whose bodies made from old trampled carpets, namelessly consume breakfasts of blood through golden straws while squatting at tables too baroque to straighten their painted legs. The dictators, condemned each day to ignore their nightmares, stand lost in palaces beneath towering doors, longing to destroy this world with their kindergarten cyclones of fury. And that spoon, a miniature lake of cream, that carrying spoon, that spilling spoon, that spoony cornucopia, it knows with all its longing for the closing of lips, in hopeful concurring that the world is for sure worth swallowing whole.
Tell me something about the background to this poem, how this one came to be.
Came to be when I agreed to appear at the 2023 Surrealist Festival in Melbourne with my poet friend Myron Lysenko. And Myron is a Ukrainian Australian, and he was writing a lot of haiku about Vladimir Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. So on the one hand, I was looking for a poem, looking to write a poem that had surrealist elements. And on the other hand, I think carrying over from Myron my feelings about Putin and his dictatorship. So there were those two elements working their way through and into the poem.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much in the world that is overwhelming, and here you surrealist or not, you focus on the spoon, the fork, the knife, the carpet, the door, those sort of the very concrete, tangible images that are in all of our lives. Is the message partly, again, that we need to remember the small things that surround us and that are so much of the tapestry of our lives but are often overlooked?
Very much. I remember Elizabeth Bishop saying that, you know, she was involved when she was living in France. She became involved with the Surrealists and had the ambition to be a Surrealist poet. And then having left France, she came to the conclusion that she didn't need to be a Surrealist because the world is surreal anyway. And this has got, hopefully, some of that philosophy working its way through, that if we look at a spoon, if we look at a fork, if we look at a knife for long enough, we begin to understand its strangeness. And we begin to, and the imagination and just the thing itself will suggest its own strangeness.
Yeah. When I read the poem, I certainly Putin emerged from it, but it wasn't just Putin. No. And it seemed to me that the poem was grappling with the ubiquity of violence, and, you know, attributing violence even to kitchen utensils. What are you trying to say about violence?
Maybe this poem and the Finch poem have something in common there. Those sort of questions ask me to draw big significances from scribblings. And all I can say is that the poem, for me, when I'm writing a poem, what I'm trying to do is let the world in all its concrete details, but at the same time, let in what I feel is important, what I feel is vulnerable, what I feel is needs to be given some attention. So there are, and whether the poem successfully melds, whether this poem successfully balances or holds in its shape the things that are important, the big things that are important to us, like how do we deal with violence? How do we understand violence? How do we respond to violence, with those other things I'm letting into the poem, which are, you know, the knife and fork and spoon, the strangeness of Baroque furniture, and the sheer sensual, the beauty and the great sensual opportunities that life offers us. Whether those two things are successfully held in balance in the poem, or successfully held out as an offering to the reader in the poem, I don't know. But I hope that the poem might raise a hair or two on the back of a neck, or might be read more than once by a reader.
I mean, we've talked a bit about the mysteriousness of poetry and how poems emerge. On that sort of same line of thinking, how much of your writing do you think is intuitive and how much of it is very conscious?
I think a lot a lot of it's intuitive in the sense that I can't explain it.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean that I don't work and work over and rework and work over again each poem.
Mm.
In this new book, An Inventory of Longing, these poems are written between 2019 and 2024. And one of the things I did with these poems was I thought, I don't care if this book is never published. I'm just going to work on these poems until I can't find anything in them to continue to change. So every poem in the book I've gone over many, 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 many times. And each time either scrapping the whole poem or each time changing a bit here, a bit there, a bit here, a bit there, or sometimes pushing two poems together and, you know, getting rid of most of the rest of them. So the poems have gone through many, many changes, transformations, revisions, rewritings, tinkerings. And most of those changes, I think, are intuitive. They're not, I don't really know exactly what I want to achieve, but I know when the poem hasn't achieved what it could have achieved.
So it's a combination of conscious and deliberate writing with intuitive writing.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, the more that we've read these poems today and talked about place, the more, to me anyway, place seems nebulous and insubstantial. Is wanting to feel at peace in place really no more than a craving, or as you put it in this poem, a longing, something to give us comfort as we navigate our way through our lives?
All of us, I think, want to feel a level of competence about ourselves and our world. And I really enjoyed the last 5 weeks in Japan. And one of the reasons that I wanted to go to Japan was to experience a culture that hasn't been subjected to a 2,000-year history of Christianity. You know, I love going to Europe, and I understand Europe. And, you know, I was raised as an Irish Catholic and spent a couple of years in a seminary thinking I was going to become a priest. So the whole Christian Catholic thing makes a whole lot of sense to me. But I wanted to be out of place, as it were. I wanted to be in a place that wasn't subjected across 2,000 years to this kind of history. And it was fascinating for me to be in Japan. But at the same time, I couldn't wait to get home when it came to the fifth week, because I did want to be back where I understood what was going on and where I had a level of competence with the language, with the customs, with the laws, with, you know, with the people, and with the conflicts that go on in the neighbourhood, and unfinished projects like that I have at home. But I know that the time will come again when I want to, you know, get out of here again and be disoriented again and be reminded again by being not at home what being at home meant. You can be at home for too long, I think. I remember once we visited a little island in the English Channel, and we were staying at a farmhouse. A woman was our host. And anyway, we went for a drive to a little village on the coast. And then we came back and she said, "Where did you go?" And she said, "Oh, we went to this little village," and we named the village. And she said, "Oh, yes, I went there as a child." And it was only a 10-minute drive away. And so you can be at home a bit too long and too restrictively, I think. But to be coming back home is a pretty good thing.
I mean, that's particularly significant in Australia because we're so far removed from the rest of the world.
Yeah, we are.
And it's quite an effort to get out of the place.
Yeah, it is.
And I've always likened it to when I get on a plane and go overseas, to the veils being lifted from my eyes. And if I stay here too long, the veil is brought back down again.
Yeah.
But I can't say that I have a clue about what's going on, even though I've lived here all my life.
Well, there's that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Kevin.
Maybe you're talking about Sydney and I'm talking about Melbourne.
Well, I was talking about Australia, so I'm an Adelaide boy, but yeah.
So you're not at home in Sydney?
Uh, no, and I'm no longer at home in Adelaide because I haven't been there for a decade or more. So,
3 years.
yeah, where is home? Um, Thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing your poems and exploring your experiences and thoughts and insights on the theme of out of place. I've enjoyed it very much. Details of Kevin's books, or some of them, and where to get them will be posted with this podcast, so please look out for them. Next up on Poets Corner will be Mark Tredinnick, reading poems and talking about the theme, the very intriguing theme of the 6 gifts. We'll see you then.